Jean, I think you spent all of your BBC career really in education. So I'd like to really go back to the beginning. What was your background before you joined?
I went to Sussex University. Or the University of Sussex to be more correct. And I was part of the first cohort of science and maths students to join the university. They had only just opened. The previous year they'd had some art students, but I was part of the first batch of science and maths students. So I did 3 years there. Having got in to read chemistry, I actually decided I didn't like slaving over a hot test tube very much and opted to do philosophy and theory of science with all the pure mathematics I could get my hands on, because I really enjoyed pure maths. So I had a good time there. And after I graduated, got a job at a brand new college of education just outside Leeds. It was, as it happened, it was a Catholic college of education. I wasn't a Catholic, so that produced one or two interesting dilemmas when it came to me doing some work in classrooms, but we got round all of that. So I was there for, I don't know, about 18 months. But because I hadn't done any teaching myself in a school, I mean, it's looking back, it was bonkers going straight into teaching teachers when I hadn't done any teaching. But that's the way it was in those days. And yes. I pointed this out to somebody, and they said, "Oh, well, we can put that right. You can do some and some. You can teach in some schools alongside teaching teachers about Piaget and all sorts of other sort of exotic stuff that I had to mug up just ahead of the students." Yes. So I worked in 2 primary schools and chose deliberately to work in primary rather than secondary because I was quite convinced that a lot of children got put off maths by the time they were 11. And in particular by the time they were 13, because they would then hit algebra, and that just actually put an awful lot of people off mathematics. So I was quite convinced if I could get in and teach primary school kids how fantastic mathematics is, they wouldn't end up being scarred later on. Who knows whether I was right or not, but I thoroughly enjoyed having a class of 9-year-olds. That was all right until we had about 80 girls to play rounders on a wet and horrible day, and I couldn't remember the rules for rounders. So I didn't particularly decide I wanted to stay in primary schools or even in teaching. The chance to move on and do something a bit more exciting with cameras and so on was irresistible. And during that time, I had a chance to start getting my hands on a bit of video equipment, and in that context was invited to move to the Road Transport Industry Training Board. So this was a brand new training board that had been set up in Wembley. So moved back down from Yorkshire to London and reconnected with various university friends and so on, which was lovely. The training board was interesting because, again, I managed to get some video skills under my belt and did a lot of work on preparing visual aids of one sort and another, endless overhead transparencies, packs of slides for lecturers to use to teach people about safe operation of petrol pumps and lorries and goodness knows what. So that was all quite fun.
Yes.
And then late in 1969, I saw an ad for the BBC wanting Open University producers.
Let me stop there. Very early days for video recording and things like that.
It was
with the training board, did you have a reasonable budget for buying?
Oh no, nothing exotic like that. We had a tiny studio and a camera, and I think the thought was that the camera would be useful to produce films or recordings of some sort to take part in the training. We never actually quite got that far, but it was quite exciting having a little studio to mess about in.
Okay, so this prepared you quite well for the BBC. So you applied for a job basically for the Open University.
Well, yes, I applied for a job to make programmes with the Open University. So I was interviewed a couple of times by Don Grattan in 5 Portland Place.
Yes, I know it well.
Got offered a post and started, I think, in about the March of 1970 at Ali Pali. So yet another new venture. Basically, we made up the rules as we went along to sort out how to provide undergraduate level mathematics tuition via a number of media, including television broadcasts, of course.
Right.
The mechanism for doing that sort of evolved as we went along. The idea of having a course team which consisted of the academics that were responsible for doing the writing and sorting out what the content was and so on. There were other academics who were particularly involved with the whole business of how you assess what the students have learnt by setting them assignments and so on. In the case of science programs, they had to do a lot of work on developing a home experiment kit, which was a very extensive thing that went out to every student that was enrolled on a science course. There were obviously admin people around, and then there were BBC producers sitting around the table talking about what could be done to illustrate the ideas that were being put over using visual means. And of course sound, because we not only made television programmes, but we made radio programmes as well.
Yes.
I think in the very early days, the first OU transmissions started in January 71. So there was a need to get a move on, basically, with all these new people trying to actually get to grips with how to make 32 programmes for the first maths course, M100, that would fit the bill. My first boss was Ed Goldwyn, and he was there looking after the maths team. I think there were about 4 or 5 of us.
Ed went on, of course, to produce programmes like Horizon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before he went off to Horizon, he defected from the mathematics team at Ali Pali to the technology team. I don't know quite why he did that, but anyway, we ended up with somebody else looking after us for a while. And that was fine. We pressed on. We made the Maths Foundation course programmes. Then we went on so that was 32 programmes for the first year. Then we went on to the second level courses. I think one of them was a full 32 unit course, but most of them were half credit courses. So you'd get 16 units, 16 television programmes, 16 radio programmes. And of course, in those days, the television programmes, I think they initially had a few transmitted in the afternoons on BBC Two because the schedule wasn't full like it is now. But eventually, of course, they ended up going out in the wee small hours of the morning. So we were subjecting the poor students to trying to understand pretty abstract mathematical ideas in the wee small hours.
Yes, long before they could record their own programmes.
Absolutely. No,
Yes.
There was no recording in those days. The poor things had to set an alarm clock and get up in the middle of the night to watch their programmes. So we were quite keen that they were red hot and did actually help them learn the content.
Can we just row back a little bit, because most people won't know about the origins of the Open University. I know that, in fact, George Auckland told me this morning, that the BBC had a proposal for a University of the Air about 20 or 30 years before that. And there was a front page of a Radio Times which talked of a University of the Air. But the political will to produce the Open University was just in the mid-60s, wasn't it?
I guess so, yes. I think by happenstance, both political parties, both the Tories and the Labour Party, ended up getting behind the idea. But it was actually Jenny Lee, who is the Secretary of State for Education, I think, who
Yes.
pushed the whole thing through and got all the Royal Charter and the accommodation and so on organised. So,
Yes.
yes, I think it had been a an idea that had been cooking for a while, but I wouldn't have. I know nothing of the BBC's ideas to do it 20 years earlier. I guess it had been kicking around in Parliament for several years, but I don't know anything about the BBC's early foray.
Okay, so the Open University was set up in the late 60s. You say you started television transmissions in about 1970, 71.
71 was the first transmission of the actual coursework for the Open University, a lot of Open University students.
So you were stockpiling material, presumably.
I think the earliest recruits were very late 69, September 69, I think John Richmond, who also worked on maths programmes, was appointed.
Right.
I was about 6 months behind him, and I think there were a few other early starters, but mostly people joined in 1970. So we didn't have very long, really, to amass programmes, so that, I mean, obviously the programmes at the end of the course, you had over a year to get them going, but
Yeah.
the early programmes had to be done pretty damn quick.
And they were produced in the original television studios that Baird and EMI transmitted their programmes in
Yes,
the
indeed.
in the 30s.
Absolutely. My first office at Ali Pali was a quaint windowless affair. I think there was a skylight and it had a gas fire. It was in the nether regions of Ali Pali, opposite the PBX offices. So in those days, you still had switchboard operators, and they holed up over there. And our offices, our maths offices, were opposite them. I think I shared an office with Viv King for a while, and there were 2 or 3 other people on the maths team, if you like.
So a lot of offices, and you've got 2 studios, I think.
Yes.
What sort of equipment did you have? How many cameras and things like that?
I think mostly 3 cameras.
Yeah.
Very big, old, I can't tell you, I can't remember what make they were, but they were on extraordinarily big, heavy dollies, of course.
Yes.
Sound people with boom mics and all of that. And that was in Studio A. Studio B was mainly used for rehearsals until a bit later on. We used Studio B quite extensively for, if you like, stop framing animations. But in about 1974, I was working on some maths stuff to do with complex numbers and complex mappings, and for the first time used computer animation. So there was a chap called Tony Pritchard, who worked at London University, who had access to a massive computer, an Atlas computer in Oxfordshire. And he would come and take a brief of what equations you were using and what you wanted to demonstrate and so on, and storyboarded the whole thing. And he had the job of converting all of that into computer code on punch cards, I think, in those days, which were then taken off to Oxford and shoved into a machine, and eventually out came a strip of film with an animation on it with curves, mathematical curves moving around in an absolutely extraordinary way. I mean, the whole thing kind of threw light on mathematics, in my view, in a way that nobody had been able to do before, because you could alter the coefficients in an equation or whatever in a dynamic way. And that absolutely fascinated people. Even some of the academics were really enthralled.
That's interesting, because if you think about the Open University material, I mean, an awful lot of it depended on graphics, on animations and things of that kind. You also needed to be able to record easily and presumably edit, because it's very difficult stuff presenting material like that on television, as I know from my work on Medicine Today.
Well, as you can imagine, on the course team there would be a variety of academics that were very heavily involved with the content and how that was all organised. And some of them were extremely good television presenters, but some of them were absolutely appalling. And we didn't always get a free choice as to who we could work with. But, I mean, there were some wonderful people on the maths course teams I worked with. Maxime Bruckheimer, Norman Gower, Oliver Penrose, all sorts of people who were wonderful mathematicians.
Yeah.
And by and large, they coped okay with television, but you could never guarantee that you were going to get the same performance twice if you had to retake something.
Yes.
And I on the production course I went to about 2 years after I'd been making programmes, I always remember Johnny somebody anyway, talking about the difficulties he had with Morecambe and Wise, because they likewise, would ad lib, and he wouldn't be able to get, the same performance twice running. And I thought, well, that's the nearest thing to what we have to cope with at the OU, really.
Yes. You had experienced television people there to help you with speaker production. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of James McCloy, who I worked with initially, who was a Tartar, but he was very, very good.
He was, but he kept a very low profile as far as the mathematicians were concerned.
Oh, really?
I did get to work with him a bit later on. I'll come to that in a minute, when I defected to science. But Ed Goldwyn was around to help a bit in the studio, but we were sort of producer-directors who wrote the scripts and produced the people and, did the whole shebang, really.
And you directed you directed in the gallery.
Directed the gallery, directed OBs, directed films, and as I said, wrote the scripts, storyboarded the animations, did the whole caboodle.
And it was all in black and white, of course, in those days.
It certainly was.
I think they began experiments with colour in one of those studios, I think, in the mid-70s, didn't they?
They did. I was a bit naughty. I started work on a series of programmes on the history of mathematics, which I loved very much because that was very close to the degree that I'd done, so it was good. And I was very anxious to get some colour experience and so on, and there was no way you could do it at Ali Pali, so I put my hand up to do the whole series on film. So that was the first sort of serious encounter I had with filmmaking. I have to say, on balance, I felt happier in the studio and directing OBs.
Yes.
But the filming was good in lots of ways. It meant that I got to Dublin to see a venerable historian of mathematics there at Trinity College, and I got to America to talk to somebody over there about some other topic. So that was interesting, and it was the first all-film, all-colour series, I think, that was done. For the OU, but very shortly after that we did start work with colour. The studio certainly had some colour cameras, and then eventually we had a colour OB as well, so that made life more interesting in some ways. Just kind of looping back to the maths experience, although I was enjoying it a lot, there comes a time when having to construct diagrams and animations to explain abstract mathematical ideas becomes very limiting.
Yes.
So after the History of Maths series, I put my hand up to work on a genetics series, because between school and university, I'd worked as a lab assistant in the brand new genetics lab in Cambridge. So that would be in 1963. So the double helix and the genetic code with Crick and Watson had only been really sorted out about 5 or 6 years before that, I think.
Yes.
So it was very early days for genetics, but I worked for a wonderful person who tried to explain what was happening with the fruit flies that I was segregating into male and female so we could control their mating and do genetic experiments on them, and petri dishes and all of that. So when it came to doing a genetic series for the OU, I felt, terribly well equipped, really.
Yes.
So that was fun. That that got me out and about, directing cameras at some interesting things which sometimes moved and were colourful and didn't have to involve animated diagrams and all the stuff that was very much a part of pure mathematics.
Yes.
So I really loved that series. And then on the back of that, so we're now up to about 1976, I managed to wangle my way onto the oceanography course. Now that was terrific as well, because I'm also a sailor, and I was a keen sailor in those days. So the ocean and all of that, tides and all those things, was very interesting. That was 76 was a big year for me. I got married in the April to Tony Stanley, who was a senior BBC engineer who working away on colour in the early days.
And a founder member, I think, of the Pensioners
Association. Yes, indeed, absolutely. And eventually the chair of the Pensioners Association for some years.
Yes.
Anyway, 76, not only did I get married, but I worked on the oceanography course and spent a wonderful 4-week assignment in America working with the oceanographers at Woods Hole on the East Coast and at the Scripps unit on the West Coast. And absolutely brilliant material. On the East Coast, I made a fascinating program with a guy called Bob Ballard, who was one of the scientists that went down to the depths of the Atlantic in a sort of titanium steel bubble that was about a metre thick. It used to take 6 hours for this thing to sink down to the ocean floor, and when you got there, you could only have the lights to show quite a small area of the ocean floor, but he was working out what was happening in the mid-Atlantic ridge. They weren't quite sure what tectonic processes were at work, and his work actually showed that essentially you've got a ridge, a volcanic ridge that's actually pushing the two sides apart. So that was fascinating. It also turned out that he was the guy that discovered where the Titanic was. So
really?
Yes, I had some wonderful, wonderful times in 1976 working on that.
Sorry, were you able to film any of this?
Oh yes,
stuff right at the bottom of the ocean.
Absolutely. We had a very good relationship with him and the Woods Hole Institute on the East Coast and on Cape Cod, and he willingly shared the footage that they had taken.
Yes.
Of what was going on and the models and so on that they used to try and work out that it was a spreading ridge. So, I got hold of that, no problems, and people were very, very good about sharing all sorts of data and footage about what they were doing in the Pacific Ocean and so on, looking at the energy dissipation from Antarctic storms right across the Pacific, all sorts of things. People were the BBC name opened so many fantastic doors for people, didn't it?
Yes, it did in those days.
And saying you were BBC and Open University certainly opened wonderful doors to academics all over the world.
Tell me about the relationship between the OU and the BBC. I mean, you were working for the BBC,
yes.
But you were very much isolated, weren't you, at Ali Pali?
We were. I think a lot of people in the BBC didn't kind of feel we were part of them, partly because we were at Ali Pali, but because it was a partnership with the OU, and in those days not many other BBC departments worked in partnership with anybody. We were definitely sort of out in the cold a bit. And over the years, I know from various documents that I came across when I was working with Don Grattan later, that there had been quite a lot of tough negotiating, let's be diplomatic, tough negotiating about the way the role of the partnership should work and how well embedded in the BBC that unit should be. But I mean, education as a whole in the BBC was sort of deemed to be out on a limb compared with news,
Yes.
current affairs, talks, documentaries, etc., sport, and so on. I mean, so the OU production unit was, the sort of extreme of that relationship, really.
Yes. But I mean, you had the double problem that you were also geographically
Yeah.
a long way away from the centre, whereas
That's true. That's
continuing
true.
education and schools and
Yes,
so on were fairly
in the mid-thick
West
of things.
London. Yes.
But Ali Pali was a wonderful place to work.
Yeah.
I ended up with an office on the front of the building. It was a bit like an ice cream kiosk. It had a little kind of sliding window for some reason, but it was remarkably close to the club.
Very useful.
And the views from the window were stunning. So, and it had lots of history associated with it.
Yes.
The old theatre at the back there, and going up the tower to see the admin people, and so I mean, an old lift that used to actually have a lift attendant at one stage, and things like that. I mean, there's lots and lots of history there.
Absolutely, and particularly the television history, of course.
Absolutely.
What was the education structure in those days? You had a controller of education.
Yes, controller education obviously looked after schools, continuing stroke further education, and the Open University production centre. But under him, in the OUPC, was a head of department, Bob Rowland, for a lot of the time. Before him, Peter Montagnon.
Of civilization fame.
Of civilization fame, yes, indeed. So there was a head of department, then there were senior producers, one for each faculty. So that was, I think, 6 senior producers. And then below them, the people that made the programmes, basically.
Yes.
Graphics department, VT editing, film editing. That was all on site. Wonderful visual effects department, of course.
Yes.
Particularly making some of the science programmes. Visual effects did a terrific job.
So you had a dedicated visual effects department, did you?
We
Or was
did.
it-
A nice man called Jerry Abouaf, who somehow or other managed to turn sort of vague scientific ideas into something that wobbled and moved in the right way.
Yes. Talking of things wobbling, did you have to use these pull animations, the old
yes.
gore and suckling animations?
Yeah, all of that. And
Extraordinary,
loads
weren't
of loads of magnetic stripe and magnetic plaques and all of those tricks.
Yeah, heroic times, really. But there was
Yeah.
also, I think, there was some resentment, really, by the channel controllers about OU material. I think David Attenborough was sort of quite anxious to get the OU material off his channel. Is that how you remember it?
I was oblivious of any of that, thank
Oblivious,
goodness.
yes.
But, I mean, certainly the programmes were shifted off anything that might be deemed to be, good public viewing times.
Yes.
So,
They would start about 11:30 at night.
Yes, they'd be very late at night and
go.
go on into the wee small hours.
But you did have repeats in the afternoons, I think.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But that obviously didn't suit everybody, which is partly why after I'd had my foray into science programmes and thoroughly enjoyed that, I came back to maths to work on a couple of series as it turned out, a half-credit courses, so 16 programmes, about maths for teachers. Because in those days, a lot of teachers in primary schools had not had a great deal of success themselves with their own mathematics. So they'd gone through university / college of teacher training college without really having a firm foundation of their own in mathematics. So when it came to teaching it to 7-year-olds or 8, 9, 10-year-olds and having to understand why the rules for fractions worked the way they did or why the number system worked the way it did and so on, they were pretty at sea, really. So
Yes.
the OU decided to put together a series of, 2 half courses aimed to help them cope with that. And there was something called New Maths beginning to appear on the curriculum anyway, so there was another reason. And calculators, calculators had appeared, and everybody's getting terribly stressed about how this is going to impact on the teaching of tables and all of that stuff.
Yes, de-skilling, yes, quite.
Yes, absolutely. So I was assigned to chose to work on those programmes, and at the time, schools had started to acquire video recorders. So I moved heaven and earth, had to go up to the head of the OUPC and further, and also to big shots in the Open University itself, and make my case for the series that we were working on not to be treated as being broadcast at, but be treated as being interactive. So, in other words, the programmes would be distributed by being broadcast. They would be downloaded onto cassettes, video cassettes, and then used in stop-start mode, so teachers could watch what children were doing and then think about it. Stop the recording, think about it, rewind, look at it again, answer some questions about what was going on in the children's heads and why that was the case. That was the first Open University course that said, no, don't watch this at wee small hours in the morning, record it and use it in an interactive way. And of course it meant that the support materials that went with that course were very different, and the whole thing went down really rather well.
Yes.
So that was in 1980. That was a pretty important year for me for a variety of reasons. That programme was one of them. The other reason it was a pretty important year was that I was scheduled to have a baby in September. Unfortunately, I was directing an OB at a school in Hillingdon to garner some material for this series, and kind of started to feel a bit strange, and cutting a long story short, was blue lighted to hospital because there was a suggestion that I was about to give birth.
Good Lord.
So this was 13 weeks ahead of the due date, so I was totally unprepared. But eventually I was very well supported by colleagues right through this, while I was in various stages of trying not to have a baby. Various colleagues came and saw me in the hospital and took direction and carried on and produced all the material that I would have produced if I'd been there doing it myself. So it wasn't quite seamless, but it was quite close.
So what about maternity leave and all that sort of thing?
I have to be quite careful what I say here because I don't know what was legal. I suspect I pushed the boundaries of what was legal because essentially my son was fine. He weighed 1.3 kilograms. That was quite small.
Yes.
And he needed to be in an incubator in University College Hospital for about 7 or 8 weeks.
Yes.
And there was no point me not working in that time because there were programmes to be made, weren't there? So essentially, I did what I needed to do to keep him fed. But apart from that, I carried on working on the programmes because I wanted to take my maternity leave once he was out of hospital and back home with me. Yeah. So that was how it all planned out. And because the BBC was a very sensible employer and I had very good colleagues and bosses,
yes.
That all actually worked out fine.
Very supportive.
Very supportive indeed. Yeah. I mean, absolutely terrific. Yes, eventually he came out of hospital. I took some maternity leave and used to take him back up to Ali Pali. Our house bordered onto Alexandra Park, so it was no big deal. Once I did get back to work, if necessary, I could run down the hill at lunchtime and see him and then run back again. That worked out very well indeed. But I was a bit relieved I wasn't at work in the palace at that one stage when it caught fire. It wasn't actually the BBC bit that caught fire. The fire was in the lump next to the BBC building, part of the building. But the people in the VT area were absolutely beside themselves that if the fire had come through the party wall, it would have wiped out all the collection of BBC tapes. So there was I wasn't part of it because I was down the hill looking after my wee one, but there was a sort of human chain of people lugging these big heavy cans of 2-inch videotape out of the building, or certainly to a safer part of the building, I think probably out of the building, so that the whole store of Open University programmes on 2-inch videotape didn't go up in smoke.
In those days, the 2-inch tapes were very expensive, but also presumably because the course material was due to be repeated endlessly.
Oh yes.
So they were particularly valuable.
They were.
Yes, I see.
I mean, because 2-inch tape was expensive, when we were making programmes in the studio, we knew that we were only allowed 3 edits. 3 edits because in the early days, the tape was physically cut with a razor blade. Iron filings or some such were put along the field lines on the videotape, looked down through a microscope, and the cut was made in the appropriate place. And I suppose partly because the tapes had to be used and played over and over again, the recommendation was that no more than 3 edits were allowed per programme. So that added also to the spice of using somewhat reluctant presenters sometimes.
Yes. Also very difficult because the sound and the picture were in different parts of the tape.
Yes, sure. We somehow got round that. I didn't go into the technicalities. But anyway, Ali Pali survived, the tape survived, the baby survived, I survived. But it was an interesting year. Yes. A very interesting year. The following year, the Ali Pali operation moved up to Milton Keynes, so 1981. The whole thing went to Milton Keynes, where they'd built a smashing new studio.
And did the Alexandra Palace area then just simply close down? Was it mothballed, or what happened to it?
It closed down. It was stripped out, and no further use was made of the premises, as far as I know. I mean, there was a transmitter. There still is a transmitter, I assume, on the tower.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's BBC owned or
the original television transmitter.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Now, did you go up to Milton Keynes?
Well, I did for a while. I travelled up there every day, so that was an hour in each direction, and I was still making programmes. But the stress of coping with the traffic on the M1 and the likely accidents on the M1 that meant that you arrived late for meetings and studios and so on was horrendous. And coupled with the fact that I still had a very small baby at home, I decided round about the middle of 81, I think, or maybe late 81, that it was time for me to be sensible. I listened to a talk by a lady called Beryl Radley, who'd been a very senior BBC lady, and I remember her saying, well, when I had my babies, I decided the sensible thing was to get a job with office hours. So I'd remembered this, and I thought, right, I think the time has come for me to opt for office hours. So I was thinking about possibly going to programme planning or somewhere like that, and somehow the news of this discussion that I'd had with somebody got back to Don Grattan. And he asked me to go and see him because, amongst other things, he was about to need a new chief assistant. His existing chief assistant was retiring. He was looking for people who might want to apply for the job. So that duly came about, and I ended up moving out of production and into a very interesting role as Don Grattan's chief assistant. So that was CACEB.
Yes, he was Controller of Educational Broadcasting, CEB.
And then I had to get used to commuting into the Langham. I had an office in the Langham that looked up Portland Place. And getting used to a very different style of life, of arranging meetings, minuting endless meetings, coping with visitors, going on a few trips to the educational broadcasting conferences in Europe. It was very interesting, but very different.
One thing you had in common with Alexandra Palace, of course, is you had an eccentric lift with an eccentric
Absolutely. A beautiful lift
yes,
with lots of marquetry in it, as I remember, or whatever the proper name for it
and
is.
Sometimes it stopped level with the floor.
And sometimes not.
And sometimes not, yes.
Yeah, but that was... gave me a very, very different perspective, obviously, on the BBC's educational output, because up until that point I'd been totally ignorant, really, of what was going on in CE or schools.
Yes.
And now I was working for somebody who was overseeing the whole lot and had to get used to various procedures that were involved in him monitoring and guiding what was going on in those departments.
Yes. Now tell us about the advisory councils and the education officers. What was tell us about the structure of the support system which education had.
That was very interesting. The context for this is that at the time there was no national curriculum. Schools did what their local authorities sorted out that they should do. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a great deal of uniformity across England. There was certainly not a lot of uniformity between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So in order for the department to make programmes that were going to be relevant and important for what was being taught, there needed to be an advice network, if you like, to find out what the needs were and also to find out how what had been broadcast had been received. Mm-hmm. So that was where the education officers came in. They were the eyes and ears of the producers out in the field, if you like, so they could see how children and teachers received the programmes, whether they achieved what they expected. And they could also find out from the teachers and the educational authorities what the upcoming needs were. Now, I guess something different but similar in some ways worked for CE as well, so that the people who ran outfits like the Centre for Language Learning, SILT was it? There were various other austere bodies that looked at what was going on in continuing and further education in the country, and they would meet and advise the education officers that worked on that part of the outfit. So that's how ventures like the Adult Literacy Project, I guess, maybe See Here, maybe some of the, I don't know about the community programmes, what their history and background was, but the education officers were obviously very much part and parcel of bridging the information between the users and the producers.
Yes. They also did a lot of sort of audience research, didn't they?
They
in
did.
Continuing education. I mean, I think of the material that was done before the Computer Literacy Project.
Yeah.
Trying to work out what the public would find acceptable and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. They did a lot of market research, if you like.
Yeah.
So part of my role as chief assistant to Don Grattan was facilitating and minuting and organising the meetings in the council chamber where the two sides got together and sorted out what was needed.
How much contact did you have with the sort of the other parts of the BBC hierarchy, the DG and so on?
DG, very little. Occasionally the BBC secretary. I did a bit of work with the legal advisor at one stage, because very shortly after I joined Don Grattan, there was a big legal case that the Inland Revenue were trying to make the Open University pay VAT on the work that the BBC was doing for them. I had to get all sorts of documents and agreements and so on together to prove that it was a partnership, not a sort of contractor relationship. But I'm afraid in the end, the Inland Revenue won the day, and the OU did have to pay VAT on what the BBC
Really?
charged them, yes. Partly because I suppose the BBC was transmitting the programmes as much as anything.
Yes.
But yeah, that was quite a financial blow, I suspect. But so I did work occasionally with other people outside of the education sector of the BBC, but not very often. It was not necessary. We had links with enterprises because sometimes they wanted to sell BBC output.
Yes.
BBC publications obviously figured very large in what we did. Radio Times, stuff like that. Yes. But not a lot to do with, if you like, the mainstream television or radio people.
Was the Open University then, as it were, hived off as a completely independent unit, or did it stay as part of the BBC, but up in
Milton Keynes?
Yeah.
As far as I know, right up until I left, it was still the producers, the programme makers, were still very much part of the BBC. But obviously sometime after I left, that must all have been rejigged because the transmission became less important as media like DVDs and so on came in, and the OU could distribute the materials in a different way. Yeah. So I guess at some stage the whole agreement with the BBC must have been reworked, but I was long gone by that time, I'm afraid.
Right. What sort of numbers, when you were working at the OU, what sort of numbers did you have in terms of people subscribing to courses and so on? Was it like the size of a university?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, there were the number of students that were
there were
enrolled.
Many thousands, were there? Yeah.
Were thousands and thousands.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
one of the most moving things we ever watched was the graduation ceremonies, where hundreds of people would gather in order to walk up with their mortarboards on and receive their degrees and so on. And you had disabled people being able to take part in that. You had middle-aged people cheering their ancient mums and dads on to get their degrees and so on. I mean, the mix of people that took Open University courses was extraordinary.
Yes.
Absolutely extraordinary. And very heartwarming that, people had put a huge amount of effort and time into following these courses that we were all part of and getting a degree. It's a hard road, but it actually suited a lot of people very well. They could carry on working apart from anything else.
Yes, indeed. Now you'd cut yourself off from the OU effectively at that stage. You were working with Don and the main output departments were continuing education, schools broadcasting, and of course radio, which one mustn't
Radio and
forget.
television, yes, of course.
So what particular projects you worked on then in that period? This is the mid-'80s,
Yes, we're talking the early 80s were largely made interesting by the BBC Micro, because that led to a great explosion of software being developed and programmes about computing and so on. And whilst I was working for Don Grattan, I think in about 83, 84, I thought, gosh, it's so difficult keeping a handle on what's going on. It's all so exciting and vibrant and new. And I pulled everything together into a sort of funny paper, like a newspaper, whatever the cheap newspapers are.
A broadsheet.
Are they broadsheets or are broadsheets the big ones?
They're the
Anyway,
big ones,
the small newspapers, I put everything together in something called computer facts, because there was a lot happening, and the schools needed to know about it. The other producers needed to know about it. The rest of the BBC probably needed to know about it. And I don't know whether I achieved anything on that score, but it did actually help to sort of get all the information together in one place. And then, of course, shortly after that was the Doomsday Project, which I don't need to go into with you because you know far more about it than I do. But that, of course, led to the video disc
yes,
era.
the short-lived video disc.
The very short-lived video disc. But that was a fantastic project. I mean, just so sad that it was ahead of its time, really.
Yes. So what happened after that?
In 1987, my husband retired, and at that stage we moved out of London up to Suffolk. And I commuted every day, one stage to Ealing Broadway from Ipswich, which was a nightmare.
That's a terrible journey.
We're talking about 5 hours travelling a day. So eventually I thought, I can't cope with this and stay sane. So I organised to work at home 1 day a week, and with the help of a fax machine and handwritten faxes, through to my secretary, life went on pretty smoothly. Actually, that was good. But as soon as it was feasible to get a computer and do some of my own keyboarding and so on, that was fine. But initially, it was definitely a fax machine and handwritten stuff.
Yes. And then, of course, eventually you could get onto emails and things like that.
Yeah.
So moving towards, I suppose, the end of your career at the BBC, how did it pan out?
How did things work out? Okay, well, Don Grattan retired and Sheila Innes took his place. Sheila obviously wasn't very comfortable with me and what I was doing, and wasn't quite sure how I sat in the structure that she had in mind. So she decided that I should be shared with a guy called James Arnold Baker, who ran Enterprises at that stage. So I had a curious role sitting in Woodlands, the Enterprises headquarters, trying to do all sorts of things to do with publishing educational software on, I don't know, floppy disks or whatever, I guess, in those days. I can't honestly remember. That was not a very comfortable time. But in 1986, so before I moved out to Suffolk, there was something called the Education Reform Act. And as I mentioned earlier, there was no national curriculum, but what the Education Reform Act did was to say, yes, there is a national curriculum, and this is what it is.
Yes.
And this is how it will be delivered to some extent. So teachers were absolutely in a muddle about what was going to be expected of them and how they delivered it. So fortunately, I can't quite remember how the production came about, but we put together a video cassette on the Education Reform Act, what it meant, how it was going to affect the way teachers operated and so on, and sold it to schools. And that went down extraordinarily well in absolutely no time at all. I think we sold 3,000 copies, which in those days seemed to be quite remarkable. But I was doing this not with any collusion from what was called educational publications. So school publications produced support literature to go with all the television and radio programmes. And CE, as you know, produced books on cooking and various other topics that were being done by producers in CE, but
Yes.
none of those publishing areas wanted to do anything about the Education Reform Act, so I was sort of out on a limb.
Even though it was very important.
It was very important, but it wasn't something that was deemed to be important enough for those people, so I got on and did it anyway. And that, I think, again, just reminded people that there were different ways of distributing educational material other than in print, which was the norm for the BBC. Well, Sheila Innes retired, and then I worked for Ifram Gwyn Jones. She was much more enthusiastic about this maverick publishing operation that was going on, and sort of brought me into White City and gave me the job of as head of educational developments, which kind of covered the maverick publishing bit, but it also meant that I looked after the team of people who did the publicity for the educational programmes. So all the advanced materials that went out to schools to tell the teachers what they could expect to have available for teaching their subjects or their children the following year. So that was a pretty big operation. And I was looking for a new person to run that side of things, and fortunately appointed one Robert Seater, who did a fantastic job of converting everybody over to using computers and all sorts of things. Really very, very interesting times. So that carried on with me happily doing all of that until 1993, at which point I decided that it was time for me to quit, partly because six years of commuting for 5 hours a day was not good for me, really. But it was self-inflicted to some extent, so I couldn't complain too much, and I still very much enjoyed the job I had and the work I was doing, the people I was working with and so on. So it wasn't too bad. I just add a couple of things. First of all, the sort of thread going through this, if you like, is that I've been pioneering all my life.
Yes.
If you think about the sort of early days, the Open University stuff, the video recordings and so on, and the Maverick publishing. So it's all sort of in keeping, really, with being a bit sort of adventurous.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you one thing, though. Which part of your career did you enjoy most, do you think?
Oh, the production. Television production, without any doubt at all. That was just fantastic. I mean, I loved every minute of it.
Yes.
Despite the fact that, facing the blank page when you've got a script to write is sometimes a bit daunting, isn't it? You've been there.
Yes.
And that can sort of freak you out a bit. And we had to make a lot of programmes. I mean, plus radio programmes on top of that.
Yes.
And all the team meetings to sort of discuss how things were done and so on. So it was a fairly hefty schedule, but I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
Absolutely loved it.
We'll talk about the very end when you left and what you felt about that. But just coming to today, I mean, you see a lot of programmes like the Attenborough programmes made in association with the Open University.
Sure.
And that seems to be the main thing that it does now in terms of the public.
That's true. Yes, I think if you follow up, they often say if you want further information, then, contact the OU.
Yes.
I did that once out of interest, and what I received was a rather glamorous poster. So I'm not sure that what you get is obviously,
Yes, very much,
hugely academic,
No.
but it is obviously a way of the OU itself, presumably, capturing people who might well be interested. The thing that more often than that strikes me is that, but for the work in the early days of, in particular, the continuing education departments, insisting that if they were dealing with difficult subjects, there was a way of the viewers or listeners following up with an action line or help of some sort. And now when you watch quite a lot of the output, there is an action line or a referral service of
Yes.
some kind tacked onto the end of it. And I think to myself, it was CE that actually kicked a lot of that off.
Yes. Broadcast support services, I think they were called, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Absolutely. Yes, I did a few things with them as well. If we've sort of finished, I've got one very last thing, David, to
Yes.
throw in, because I was very lucky, having been appointed by Don Grattan in the first place, and then revisiting his office and getting the chief assistant role and so on. So I did very much stay in touch with him after he retired.
Yes. Yes.
And I went to visit him probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when he was fairly poorly.
Yes, he was very poorly, wasn't he, for many years?
He was. And he, for once, he said little and listened a lot.
Yes.
Normally, I think I was used to it being the other way around. He was a very articulate speaker and a very good boss to have. But after half an hour or so, trying to talk to him and explaining what I was up to in my life and so on, we got round to reflecting about the BBC. And I said to him, what are you most proud about looking back on your BBC career, and how would you summarise that? And he thought very hard, and after an interminable wait, he said, "The BBC as an engine of change." And I thought that was just so spot on,
Yeah.
and so such a wonderful phrase to, if you like, encapsulate a lot of what went on in the educational departments.
Yes, indeed.
So I'd like to leave that thought with whoever listens to these 100 voices.
Oh, I think people will. But one thing about Don, were you at Don's funeral? I think you
Yes,
were.
I
and
was.
It was.
I was.
They played the
fanfare to the OU.
The fanfare
yes.
to the OU. Yes,
Absolutely.
We ought to play it at the end of your interview.
Yes, that would be fun, wouldn't it?
This is the Open University.